It seems they breathe before our eyes. The characters from the Last Supper we were talking about in our last video. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. They seem to breathe before our very eyes. We feel any moment now Peter will turn to us to say something, or James will move his arm just above the table. We feel the panic in the words just spoken by Jesus. Someone among you will betray me. The spinning animated bodies twist and turn around Christ with the shock of it, with the unbelief on their lips and the denying gestures of their hands. For the first time in the history of art, social painting was born. Leonardo was hundreds of years ahead of his time, almost Jungian in his philosophical, psychological penetration into every character's personal condition. All this was, of course, so cleverly accomplished as to go by totally unnoticed by the status quo. The ingenuity of Leonardo was such that he could show outright what was forbidden while disguising it within accepted parameters. Now that's genius, if you ask me. It would take another genius to see what Leonardo was getting away with, but fortunately for Leonardo, no one in the refectory even came close to the caliber of intelligence. And so we have the social agreement constantly putting pressure on every activity in society throughout history. And this was my point. It was closer to our times when Beethoven lived, 1770-1827, and composed the greatest music ever written. Was it not he who was ostracized as a musician because of his hearing problem? After all, the social agreement was you couldn't be an accepted member of musical circles if you were deaf. Wow. The prevailing logic was, what kind of musician could you hope to be without your hearing? To a musician, hearing was the major organ you relied on to compose music or function as a conductor. If anyone had to have good hearing, it was a conductor. It was simply unacceptable to choose a musical career, becoming and eventually going deaf and hope to thrive. Beethoven was seen as a madman, an eccentric living on the fringes of society. For years, that is how he was thought of behind his back. However, it is to be noted, he was shown the respect due him on the average. In a letter Beethoven wrote to his brothers Karl and Johann in Heidelstadt, October 6, 1802, he specifically describes himself coming close to suicide, were it not for art which kept him back from that brink. Imagine Beethoven wanting to kill himself. Quote, "Oh, you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. And I must live almost alone, like one who has been banished. My misfortune, his deafness, is doubly painful to me, because I am bound to be misunderstood. For me, there can be no relaxation with my fellow men, no refined conversations, no mutual exchange of ideas. And finally, thanks to my art, I did not end my life in suicide." That's terrible, isn't it? What society didn't calculate in the equation was Beethoven's genius. It surpassed their wildest imagination and burst the social agreement to pieces. Here was this deaf composer writing unheard of music that tore at the heart and soothed the savage beast inside the troubled soul. Here again was psychologically penetrating music that riveted one's insides, twisted them around and around with overturned emotions. Here was a convoluted mind so strong, the music blasted into the theaters and overwhelmed the cynical art critics into submission. By the time he conducted his Ninth Symphony, 1822-1824, his last, first performed in the theater Kartnertor in Vienna, 1824, now late in life and quite deaf, he received a standing ovation with enormous enthusiasm. Society had ushered him into its own because his music transcended all boundaries. Beethoven made them accept him, and in doing so forged a new social agreement that did not set limits on what an artist had to be to do his, her, it, them art. That, in essence, it was now permitted to be an eccentric. It was now permitted, even expected, of every artist to be one. How the circle turns and makes of life a great arc that sweeps circumstances into existence as easily as it wipes them away. And all this on changing whims and attitudes, as if the art of living was a fashion ensemble. We should all be ashamed of ourselves. It's frightening. It's frightening to realize the extent the social agreement holds sway. It is alarming to recognize its power and what it can do with it. It's almost as if it, being an invention of man in time, has become independent of him and has its own entity. However, as we have seen in Beethoven's case, it can be influenced by daring, knowledge, and evidence, even changed if the forces behind the change are strong enough, such as Beethoven's music. It's not necessarily cut and dry, though. It seems, as society changes, so does the social agreement for that time. We do not have the same social agreement now as held sway, for instance, in the Roman Empire. Nor was that the same as the Sumerian civilization's social agreement that had come before, much further back in time. Of course, we can find similarities, but these are far and few, mostly referring to human nature's basic needs. Some things in human nature do not change, and these tend to be incorporated into any new social agreement of any time. But everything else is totally different for every age. If you compare the different ages, you will be hard-pressed to find similar social agreements being practiced. Every age is so diverse in kind and intent that the social agreement in each is unrecognizable from the last. Each evolves according to that society's needs and requirements of the time. It evolves around what are accepted codes of behavior. One must think about how much knowledge is available at the time and how much ignorance. If there is more ignorance than knowledge, that age will have a very stringent social agreement with barbaric, almost savage means to cope with its problems. On the other hand, if that age is advanced in science and technology, it will be a more relaxed age, an age that does not function with panic and fear, allowing for a mild social agreement that does not place unbearable demands on the population. That age will be considered enlightened. Our age falls into this category, even though barbaric acts of violence still do burst forth from time to tarnish its promise. For instance, in the Middle Ages, that saw scientific activity as alchemy and the devil's work. Based on superstition and ignorance, the Catholic Inquisition would hunt you down and burn you alive. The social agreement was such, and because it was based on ignorance mixed with fear, as a consequence, these intellectuals were seen as heretics and a threat to the church and world order. How wrong could they have gotten it? The system was afraid of their scientific claims because they did not match Bible, and the world at the time revolved around this sacrosanct book. We will look at a more enlightened age on the next time I see you. Take care.